are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is about 8 men who were murdered in Toronto's LGBTQ+ village. Months of surveillance, a cannibal ring, multiple survivors, and 8 murder victims, all in one case. This may seem like a fiction story about to take you on a wild ride, but just remember, this all happened in real life to real people. I also want to thank our sponsor, Magellan TV, my favorite documentary streaming service. I really do love it. I watched an amazing one called The Nightclub Killer about 2 women who were killed, of course, in a nightclub, and this was believed to be the beginning of this serial killer's rampage. As you know, if you've heard me talk about Magellan TV, there are so many different documentaries on this service. There are anything from well-known stories to ones you've never heard of before, and there's also over 3,000 of them to choose from. So if you've binge watched every YouTuber's videos and need something to watch, I highly recommend going to Magellan because you are more than likely going to find one that piques your interest. So if you want to try it out, go to try.magellantv.com/Brooke McKenna for a 1-month free trial. And thank you to Magellan for sponsoring this portion of the video. Now let's get back to the story. I do want to say before I begin that these names are a little bit hard to pronounce. I am trying my very best. I tried to collect from different sources, but if I do mess them up, I am so incredibly sorry. So it was 2010 in Canada, and Skandaraj Navaratnam lived in Toronto. He was a 40-year-old man who had moved to Toronto about 20 years prior. He had come from Sri Lanka as a refugee and had gone to school at the University of Toronto, which led to him being a teaching assistant. He was known to friends as Skanda, and he was said to be charming, kind, charismatic, and everybody loved him, and he loved to laugh. He was always well-groomed and wanted to be seen in a positive light. He was the kind of man that would help anyone. In fact, one of his friends' sons went missing, and he immediately hopped on a bike and started searching before anybody else even got the chance to. His family said that he was like the live wire in their family since childhood. He had recently gotten a new puppy. He loved going clubbing downtown at the nightclubs in what is known as the gay village. Skanda was a very openly gay man, and he had struggled with coming out in the past. In fact, his brothers knew about this, but his mother still did not know he was gay because he was afraid to tell her. But he did have a steady boyfriend named Bruce, and he was really allowing himself to be who he truly was at this time. While in Canada, he still wanted his family back home to have a good life, so he was working all kinds of jobs and sending back as much money as he could to them. Sri Lanka was a place that Skanda was very passionate about, and he became an environmentalist and wanted to protect the forests and the jungles there. He appeared to be the kind of man that you would feel honored to just be around. On September 6th, Skanda was seen at a nightclub called Zippers when he vanished. When he hadn't returned 10 days later, his friends did report him missing. Now, this may seem like quite a bit of time to wait. However, his friends wanted to make sure he was really missing and wouldn't just come back on his own. You see, unfortunately, they were used to doing things on their own and not getting much help from police. It's something that the entire LGBTQ+ community were painfully aware of, that due to their sexual preferences, they could be viewed as less worthy of assistance or help because they were viewed in some ways and to some people as less than other humans. They were worried that if officers knew that Skanda was last seen at a gay bar in this gay village, that they wouldn't want to investigate his disappearance with as much effort as a missing heterosexual white male. But in the end, they needed help to find him, and so they did report him missing to police, and his friend Jean would text him every morning, but he wasn't getting any responses, and witnesses had last seen Skanda walking near the Zippers bar, but this was actually on Church and Carlton streets, and he was also with an unknown man, unknown to those witnesses. When investigators began to search, there was not much to go on. Skanda was not being found dead or alive anywhere, but there was one man that his friends found very suspicious during this entire thing. This was his boyfriend, Bruce. The two had been dating for quite a few years. It was kind of an on-again, off-again thing, but his friends had met Bruce many different times, and once said that Bruce was nice and confident, had a good handshake, appeared to be level-headed, but there was just something that he didn't like about him, a gut instinct. Then one of Skanda's friends found Skanda inside, this was before he disappeared, they had found him inside one of the village's bathhouses. Now, this was a place you would often go to be able to get with a gay partner, and it was somewhere where if you didn't want others to know you were a gay man, you could go and this could be done in private. This was really unlike Skanda to do anything like this, and so when his friend saw him there, he kind of questioned him about what had happened and what he was doing and what happened to his boyfriend, Bruce. And that's when Skanda apparently revealed to this friend that he was scared of Bruce. Yet with no body and no evidence against Bruce or anybody else, there was nothing that Skanda's friends or investigators could do. With only one missing man, this didn't seem like a huge problem for the Toronto area just yet. However, it turned out that men had been going missing from this village for decades prior, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Because it would only take another 4 months for another man to go missing. And this was 42-year-old Abdulbasir Fazee, who had a wife and 2 daughters and lived in a nearby suburb. He worked at a printing company. He was known to be funny, and he was a smart man who absolutely loved his kids. He would work overtime to just make sure that they had everything they wanted for Christmas. Now, on December 29th, a little after Christmas, this was in 2010, Abdulbasir called his wife to say that he was actually going to be staying late at work to hang out with his coworkers and he would be home later. But he never was. He was reported missing that next day, and through some investigating they found that he was actually secretly a gay man. Now, he would often visit the village, and the last time he was seen was on that December 29th at a bathhouse named Steamworks. However, his car, a 2002 Nissan Sentra, was found a week later near a suburb called Mallory Crescent. This had a whole bunch of expensive homes. It appeared to be a normal suburb, but his car was found there, and he was found nowhere around there. His wife, who had no idea about his double life and was obviously shocked, said she believed that there was no foul play in this case, that Abdulbasir had left them and didn't want to be found. His friends, however, said that that was not the case because he was one who absolutely adored his children and would never have left them behind, even if his relationship with his wife wasn't exactly what he wanted. But to his wife, she had a husband who had secrets and who had never been found, and who a crime scene didn't even belong to, so she was certain that she had just been left. And she was now working 18-hour days to take care of her daughters all on her own. His daughters began taking his picture into their rooms and secretly crying so they could appear stronger in front of their mother. And once again, this was an unsolved disappearance. 2 missing men didn't cause much of an uproar, especially because of the lack of media coverage of missing gay men. 2 years later, it was October 19th of 2012 when 58-year-old Majid Kayhan disappeared next. He had 2 children and 1 son who was an adult by this time, who was the one to report him missing after a week of no contact with him. Now, he also had 3 grandchildren and an entire family who didn't know that he too was gay. And Majid actually had a boyfriend, at least a friend with benefits. He knew this man from a job he had gotten through a landscape company, and they had gotten closer. This was a man named Bruce. Seeing the pattern yet? Well, Majid was last seen by a friend on Alexander and Yonge Streets, and then he was gone. At this point, with 3 missing men, the public did begin to worry that there was a serial killer in the area, and all of these men resembled one another, and they had disappeared from the same area, and pressure was put on investigators to actually look into this because people of the public believed something was happening and they were just ignoring it. This was when they created Project Houston to begin looking into these cases. This was named basically because they believed there was a problem, and they said, Houston, we have a problem. So it was called Project Houston. For the next 2 years, from 2012 to 2014, the task force was working to help locate these missing men. They also were looking for a possible killer, but that's when they came across a man they referred to as Suspect Zero. He had come across their desks because Interpol had contacted them and said that there was someone that they needed to be on the lookout for. This was a 63-year-old man who was a volunteer hockey coach and a hospital technician, and investigators obtained a warrant to track his vehicle. This warrant was actually sealed from the public due to a confidential source and an underage victim, or possible underage victim, that needed protection. They also obtained a search warrant for his residence in Peterborough, and they believed that he had something to do with the murders, especially to Skanda, the first victim. Interpol had actually come across Suspect Zero on a website called Zambian Meat, where he was bragging about killing and eating a man in Toronto in 2012. This perfectly fit the timeline for the missing men and the area they had disappeared in, as well as the description that this person made of the man he allegedly ate. This led them to watch this man 24/7 for the next 7 months. His name was James Brunton, and he ended up being arrested in May of 2013, but not for murder or even abduction, but for making, possessing, and distributing explicit photos of children. Now, he had been recording his underage hockey players in the showers and the changing rooms, and he also had been grooming a 15-year-old boy through a sexual and cannibal fetish website. James had paid this boy $3,500 for photos and videos, and that wasn't even the worst part. A contract was found between James and this boy that claimed that when the boy turned 18, he would come to Canada to be with James, and he would become James's sex slave and would be tortured and then cannibalized. James ended up being sentenced to 15 months and 3 years probation, and is banned from using the internet or going in public areas without the presence of his wife, which he still had. James had been ruled out as a suspect in these disappearances, and it turned out he had never really killed anyone, and he had lied on this cannibal website. He had never eaten them, he had never done anything of the sorts. It was all talk. But investigators weren't completely back to square one, because they had come across a possible witness. This time, a man was interviewed due to being friends with the first 2 victims, who were Skanda and Abdur Basir. Investigators found that through an email called Silver Fox, he had talked to both of them. He also had belongings in both of their homes. He had been to both of their homes, and he was said to be friends with them. Now, having any sort of connection between 2 of the victims that had disappeared made investigators want to talk to him to see if he knew any more information, or if he knew anything that had happened to them at all. He was more than happy to come in. He said that he had met Skanda through a bar called the Black Eagle, and said that it was never sexual between the 2 of them, but he also said that he knew the 3rd victim as well, Majid Kayhan, because he had worked for him for a few months. Majid had worked for him. He said that he did have a sexual relationship with Majid, but he broke it off. This man's name was Bruce MacArthur, but investigators believed that this man didn't have anything more to do with the victims than simply being their friends. He was never thought of as a suspect. He was never questioned. Many people knew each other in this small area, especially in the gay village, and so this didn't really point to anything. In 2014, Project Houston was no more. Only 18 months after it began, it was shut down by the police chief. So after 40 warrants of no criminal evidence being found and no foul play being shown as happening to these men, it was completely closed. Yet then another man would disappear. It was August 15, 2015, when 50-year-old Shiroz Mohammadi was reported missing by his wife, Yumi. Shiroz had come to Canada as a refugee from Iran when he was only 20 years old, and he began working in an auto parts factory while also becoming a taxi driver. Now, Shiroz was said to be the jokester of his friends. He absolutely loved doing anything outdoorsy, such as camping or soccer, and he was also living with his wife in an apartment in Scarborough, and they were said to be soulmates and so incredibly happy together. Now, he was not known to have any connection to the gay village or to be gay at all. However, this is something that could still be a secret today, but he had gone to bed the night before with his wife, and the next day, she woke up and he was gone. Yumi figured that he had gone to work, but he never showed up and he never returned home that night. When her husband vanished, Yumi was said to leave her job due to psychological trauma and began struggling to take care of their son. The disappearance affected her emotionally and mentally. This wouldn't be the end either, because 2 years later, on April 15th, 2017, Salim Asen was walking Bloor Street East and Ted Rogers Way when he vanished. Salim was 44 years old and frequented the village after moving from Turkey for a boyfriend. Salim was said to be tender and kind, but often struggled with substance abuse, and he had spent much of his life supporting his family and was quite unhappy. Yet he had started working at this peer training program, and he wanted to help others in any way he could. Salim was said to be passionate about justice and wanted everyone around him to be well. Now, he did everything through a lens of deep emotion and curiosity. But he had started talking about believing something bad was going to happen to him just before he vanished. He was said to be walking these streets because he was a true romantic who believed in the power of love. Yet instead of love, he was met with evil. 2 months later, on June 26th of 2017, 49-year-old Andrew Kingsman vanished after attending Toronto's Pride Parade in the gay village. 3 days later, he was reported missing by a neighbor at his apartment building who he lived in with his cat, and his neighbor was worried that he didn't come home to take care of his cat, who he deeply loved. But due to this area being covered by surveillance cameras during the Pride Parade, investigators were able to track down Andrew's last moments. He appeared to have gotten into a 2014 Dodge Caravan with chrome siding with another man. Now, Andrew was one of those men who looked big and buff, but had such a big, pure heart, and he was known as the gentle giant, and so many in the village knew him. He was a prodigy at chess from a young age, and he also loved volunteering to help others, especially when it came to HIV and AIDS and that network. He just wanted to make the world a better place for those struggling to survive. He knew what it was like to be a survivor himself because he had recovered from cancer that was supposed to be terminal. His friends said that he recovered by sheer force of will. However, the cancer did come back, but he was not giving up. He was going to fight again. Like I said, he was well known, well loved, so everyone realized immediately when he disappeared. This was said to be the first time the investigators cared, because this was the first white victim. The public outcry that followed prompted investigators to launch a new task force. This time it was called Project Prism, and it was looking into the disappearances of Andrew and Salim because not all of these disappearances had yet been connected. So many were saying that these cases hadn't been looked into because these men were brown and gay, and if they were straight and white, they would have already been found. This wasn't out of nowhere either, this theory that people were coming up with, because there was a history of people in this village going missing and not being helped, or just having crimes against them that weren't ever dealt with. When investigators entered Andrew's home, they found that he had an entry on his calendar the same day he vanished. This was one name, Bruce, at 2 or 3 p.m. They also found that Andrew had a fascination with serial killers. He had researched John Wayne Gacy as well as Dennis Andrew Nilsen and had drawings and writings about them on his computer. And in fact, A manager at the AIDS Foundation where he would often go was interviewed, and they found that Andrew had been talking to her about a boyfriend of his who was very much into the psychology of serial killers and how they functioned just like him. However, she did not know this boyfriend's name. But can you guess it? I bet you can. Search warrants were granted for his IP address logs and his email accounts, as well as his cell phone records, and investigators continued to look into Andrew's computer, hoping to find something that would lead them to a suspect. That's when they found something that appeared to be eerily familiar to this whole case. That was the name Bruce. It was on a folder called Pictures/Bruce, and inside were 12 photos of a man investigators had seen before. At the same time, they were searching for the van that Andrew had gotten into, and they had come up with vehicles matching this description as well as under the name Bruce. One of them ended up being someone they interviewed when they were doing the Project Houston investigation, Bruce McArthur. It seemed more than a coincidence now that this man seemed to know every victim. The finger was also pointing to him, because the other 4 Bruces didn't have a van that had chrome siding as shown in the surveillance video. They now had their prime suspect, a man they had known since the very beginning. 3 months after Andrew's disappearance, investigators began tracking his every move with these mobile surveillance unit. They placed tracking devices on his vehicle, but as soon as they did, one of them was actually sold. This was none other than the Dodge Caravan that Andrew had gotten into, seen on the surveillance footage. However, this meant that investigators could obtain the vehicle for examination without Bruce knowing they were on his trail. Investigators went to the auto parts place. They had gotten it back from the owners and towed it away and sent it in for DNA testing. But the owner had something to tell them. They had found blood inside. As soon as investigators got it to the lab, they found that 18 different spots of blood were inside, and they were sent in for testing as well as the semen found. An officer said that he also observed dried liquid on the vehicle that was covering the tailgate from one side to the other and was also covered in small flies, but no other flies were present anywhere else on the van as well as on the surrounding vehicles. Project Prism began to develop a plan to catch a killer, and they wanted to ask Bruce to come down to the police station for another interview. They were now worried that he had an accomplice, that there was more than one killer, and that if they caught Bruce, they would never catch this other person, because Bruce had called 2 different people the night that Andrew disappeared. This was his best friend and his ex-wife. So they were hoping to bring him in and question him a little bit, and this would cause him to reach out to the others and tell them to, not say anything, to go into hiding or whatnot. I couldn't find if he contacted anyone after this interview, but investigators did end up looking into several of his family members and friends, and this included boyfriends, roommates, and ex-wife, and his son. And it was found that his family had gotten rid of the van or helped him get rid of it. However, none of them appeared to have any further connections to the disappearances. That's when the DNA evidence from the van came back and revealed that it was a match to Andrew and Salim. Where were these bodies? Well, investigators weren't sure yet, but they did know they needed to move quickly because Bruce might be in the middle of capturing his next victim. You see, investigators had obtained search warrants for his computers and his apartment. They had tried to go in December 5th of 2017, but had to leave because Bruce actually came home early and they were almost caught inside. Now, they were worried about him catching them because he could possibly destroy evidence that they needed to convict him of these disappearances, especially without a body. But 2 days later, they did try again, and they found about 50% of the information on his computer by the time that he came home and they had to leave. But a month later, on January 18th of 2018, while they were continuing to watch Bruce from afar, they saw a man enter his apartment. And for the first time since they'd been watching, they believed someone was actually in danger. Investigators wasted no time. They got into the elevator and they all crammed in and started going up to the 19th floor where his apartment was. And it was going so incredibly slow that they feared that this man would be killed before they got to him. Bruce answered the door when they knocked, and immediately he was arrested while his date was found chained to the steel bed frame. This date, or this victim, was moments away from his own murder. And this man, whose name was John, was found restrained in Bruce's bedroom with his mouth taped shut. And when investigators removed the tape, he actually told them the whole story. He had met Bruce on a dating app called Growler, and they had become sexual before, but this time it was different. He said that Bruce had asked him if anybody knew he was there, and John said it was a secret due to him having a wife. Now, John said he had come to Canada 5 years prior from the Middle East with his family, and he didn't know he was gay, and so that's why he was having these secret affairs. But that day, John said that Bruce wanted to try something different with him, and he pulled out a pair of handcuffs. He was then chained to Bruce's steel bed frame, and a black bag was put over his head. He couldn't see or breathe through the bag, and he tried removing it, but his mouth was taped shut. And then, thankfully, investigators showed up before anything could happen further. When all of this came to light that Bruce was arrested, it was revealed that a survivor had informed the police of Bruce McArthur much before this. This survivor had claimed that it was 2011 when he met Bruce on a website called Silver Daddies. This was when they began meeting up and having some fun, and this was for the next 5 years. They were pretty consistent. Everything was going well, and they actually wanted to have a relationship, or at least the survivor did, but Bruce wasn't really into it. One time, it happened at a house where Bruce was house sitting at, and he had the keys for, but toward the end, the survivor said that he began to feel stalked. He would always have notes from Bruce, and Bruce would always show up anywhere he was, and he just felt like Bruce was always watching him. But the year before Bruce was caught as a serial killer, it was June 20th of 2016, when Bruce had told the survivor to get into the van, his van, outside of his home for some sex. This wasn't really unusual for the two of them, but he did notice that there were plastic tarps all on the van, but he figured because Bruce owned a landscaping company that this was normal for him to have in the back. So he got in, and Bruce had a much different plan for the two of them that day, because he proceeded to strangle and hold down the survivor with a look that the survivor said that he knew he was going to kill him. He was trying to fight back, but he was stuck under the weight of Bruce's body, and he continued to try to move until he flipped himself over onto his stomach. The whole time, for about 4 minutes, the survivor was completely unable to breathe. He began thinking of his mother and the fact that he didn't want his mother to have to go through his funeral, and he wasn't giving up. He ended up pulling his arm out from under himself, out from under his weight and Bruce's weight, and then he could flip himself over. Then he pushed Bruce off of him with every ounce of strength that he had left, and he got out of the van, and with a voice he barely had left, he said to Bruce that he was under arrest, and then he called 911. That is when Bruce got into the van, began speeding away, and the survivor wasn't letting him go. He got into his own car and started speeding away towards him as well. But when he was on the phone with 911, the operator told him not to chase him, so he went back to where this happened to talk to the police. Unfortunately, the police took his statement and never talked to him again. It turned out that Bruce had gone to the police himself and said that the survivor was the one who assaulted him. The survivor didn't push for charges because he just wanted him to stay away from him. And he also had so much guilt that he didn't kill Bruce when he had the chance, but he didn't because he didn't want to be charged with hurting him when really he was the victim. Investigators said that McArthur honestly, though mistakenly, believed the man had consented. Then, when Bruce was arrested for these murders, the survivor was contacted to be brought in for questioning. It turned out that this was before Salim and Andrew's murders, and if investigators would have locked Bruce away when the survivor had told them, those two might have still been alive. But who was Bruce McArthur other than a possible killer? Well, he had grown up on a farm in Woodville, Ontario with one sister. It was said that his father was an abusive alcoholic who didn't show his son affection. In fact, to keep his father away from her, he locked his sister inside of a bedroom. He had then went on to get married to his high school sweetheart, and they had 2 children. But by this point, he was a grandfather and someone who worked at a mall as a Santa. His landscape business was thriving, and he had recently come out as a gay man after separating from his wife. He then moved to Toronto and was known to be a lovely, trustworthy guy. The men that he would hook up with always wanted a relationship, but he never wanted more. He was known to show up to his jobs every day with a smile on his face. He was always gentle. His customers loved him and they trusted him. He was never known to have any sort of temper. He had no criminal record and was loved by the community. But this didn't mean that he wasn't charged with a crime prior to these murders. It just meant that there was no record of that anymore. But we will discuss that later on. At this point, Bruce was immediately arrested and charged with the first-degree murders of Salim and Andrew. He began to say that he hadn't seen Andrew since 2016, a year prior to his disappearance, whereas with Salim, he said he looked familiar, but he didn't even know who he was. He said that he picked him up once and may have had a sexual relation with him once before he left, and he never saw him again. They knew he was lying, and they knew they weren't going to get any more answers from him, but they needed to find where these men were, or where they had been buried. While investigators were looking for more clues and searching his home, investigators found his new van, and that is when inside they found a bar wrapped in tape, a dark brown leather lacing, and a fur coat, and these were all taken in for DNA testing, which came back to match Salim, Andrew, and the first victim, Skanda. They also found Salim's notebook and Skanda's bracelet. They searched his computer intently and found more folders, which were in the trash, called homicide photos. These photos were of the missing men. They were all in his bed, nude, in a fur coat, and a few had a rope around their neck with their eyes taped open. He had 9 folders for each victim, including one which was waiting for photos of a deceased John that thankfully never came because investigators had saved him. 3 days later, investigators had turned their attention to another home. This is on Mallory Crescent, nearby where the second victim, Abdur-Basir's car, was found. This was also the location of Bruce's landscaping tools. Now, investigators had previously checked this shed and they had found no bodies, but they hadn't searched the entire property, which is what they were going to do now. But this was mainly because there was a family living there, one that was not Bruce's. The owners of this home had met Bruce through his sister because she had asked them if, since they had a 2-car garage they didn't use, if Bruce could use it to store his landscaping tools when they left for the summer, and they said yes, and he had the keys and was able to take care of the property all summer. Investigators found a suitcase, duct tape, rope, 2 large knives, and 4 hacksaws. But this couple trusted him and they thought he was a wonderful man. They said he even employed other men who were often younger and of Middle Eastern descent. Yet this couple, these owners, were kicked out of their home by investigators who believed bodies may be on their property. Investigators went to all of the property of Bruce's landscaping jobs and took cadaver dogs to go inch by inch to find these evidence. The dogs went straight to these huge planters, and police took them in for an x-ray and found bodies. 8 days later, it was revealed to the public that these bodies had been found. Bruce McArthur was officially classified as a serial killer. Investigators had found these large planters on the property and decided to look just in case, but at the very bottom were the dismembered remains of men. Skanda, Abdur-Basir, Majid, Saros, Salim, and Andrew were all found, but unfortunately they had not survived. They had been strangled to death, but this isn't where the bodies stopped, because that was only 6, and he killed 8. These were 2 men who had never been reported missing. One of the bodies was identified as 47-year-old Dean Lisowick, and Dean loved to paint. He loved to send gifts to his family. He was known as a sweet guy who would stick up for anybody who was being harassed in that village area, especially if they were being harassed for being gay. And he had a daughter, but he had developed severe mental health problems through the years, as well as substance abuse problems, and he was often homeless and on the streets or, going to shelters every once in a while, but he also made money by working as a sex worker, and he eventually just stopped showing up anywhere. But since his family didn't normally know where he was, they didn't report him missing. But it turned out he was the 6th victim of 8. The other body remained unidentified, and this is when investigators actually put up a photo of him at a press conference hoping someone would come forward. His family finally did, and he was 37-year-old Krishna Karunaratnam, who was from Sri Lanka just like Skanda was. But Krishna actually fled the country's civil war and began working any job he could to begin sending home money. He had applied for refugee status but was denied twice, and then he stopped calling back home at all. But his family believed he was in hiding because he didn't want to be sent back to Sri Lanka, so they didn't want to call the police. But he wasn't in hiding. He had been Bruce McArthur's 5th victim. These men had all been killed around the time of their disappearances, and it turned out after 8 victims that still wasn't the end, because that's when other survivors began coming forward. The first was Mark Henderson, who claimed that 9 years before the first murder even occurred on Halloween night in 2001, he held the door open for Bruce at his apartment and believed that he was just going to his own apartment, but that's when Bruce followed him to his own door, and when he unlocked the door, Bruce began to hit him over the head with a pipe. Now, Mark was a nurse and knew that there was an indentation in his skull and cerebral spine fluid, as well as blood coming down. But Mark was left with fractured hands and fingers, and Bruce wasn't stopping. But suddenly, he did, and he just left. Turned out that Bruce actually went to police and turned himself in. This was before anyone had been killed, or so we think. But he was actually taken to trial for this assault. And that is when he got minor assault with no jail time due to Mark being a sex worker. And then he applied for a pardon, which expunged the crime from his criminal history. Then, around the same time where the first survivor we talked about inside of the van was strangled, there was another survivor around this time as well. This is a man named Sean Cribben, who had met Bruce online a few years prior as well. They met up often. They talked about the serial killer in the area, but Bruce didn't want to talk about it and just started talking about his job. The same job where the bodies would later be found. But when they met up that day in 2017, Sean actually said he agreed to allow Bruce's experience, which was that he wanted someone to be completely submissive and so he could find their buttons to push. Sean said that his boundaries were not being respected. He had been drugged, he began getting nervous, and then he was sexually assaulted. He believes that he lost consciousness, and when he came back to, he heard Bruce's roommate inside of the apartment, and he tried to ask to go home, but Bruce said that he needed to finish first. And he doesn't remember how he got home that day, but photos have been found of Sean unconscious on Bruce's computer, and he was in what is believed to be Bruce's kill position, but somehow he survived. Another survivor had known Bruce for 20 years. He was friends with him. His name was Peter, and he would hang out with him all the time when he was in town. But one day, it turned sexual. They had dinner, and Bruce began talking about liking aggressive sex. And, this was especially with men while he was out of town in Italy. And he then kissed Peter. Things escalated from there, and suddenly Peter found his head being shoved into Bruce's crotch, and he was uncomfortable. He got away from Bruce and he never saw him again. A homeowner who had used Bruce as a landscaper as well came forward saying that Bruce had watched their home often and when they were in Africa, and when they came back home one time, Bruce actually apologized to them because he had spilled Coke on their floor. He had tried to clean it. He couldn't. There was a stain about 2 feet by 3 feet on the floor when they looked. They had to remove the carpets, and they now believe this could have been blood. By this point, Toronto police had started a dedicated missing persons unit after the public scrutinized their lack of efforts and resources into the investigations of these missing men. Investigators also believed that there could be victims even farther back, going back to as far as the 1970s, because there had been many men who vanished and were never found. They said the fact that the 4 persons who survived McArthur's attacks, only 2 had made a police report, it truly adds merit to the suggestion that police need to expand the scope of their investigation into Bruce McArthur beyond what is already apparent to us. Investigators feared that there were not only more men in the area who were murdered by Bruce, but also in different places that Bruce had traveled to. They began working with Interpol to investigate possible victims, but they didn't find any more. It was also found through others who knew Bruce that his motive may have had something to do with his erectile dysfunction. One man said that Bruce only received oral sex because he had a hard time performing. It was also believed that another motive could be that he was having affairs as early as the 1970s with men when he was living his double life and still had a wife, and that one gay man that he had an affair with actually outed him to his wife before he did, and basically changed his whole life. It was believed that he could have been really angry towards the gay community because this one gay man outed him.
Todd McArthur faces a number of charges in a completely separate case, and while there is a publication ban, we can tell you that he has a very long history of criminal charges and convictions.
I have nothing else to say.
The son of alleged serial killer Bruce McArthur leaves an Oshawa courthouse in silence, facing numerous charges stemming from obscene phone calls. 36-year-old Todd McArthur had little to say about his father, facing 5 counts of first-degree murder, only that we have been going through hell. This has been absolute hell. That's all we have to say for now. There will be no further comment from the family.
On January 29th of 2019, Bruce pled guilty to all 8 counts of murder, yet never officially confessed. This also meant he didn't have to have a trial. Now, he also refused to say anything, but a friend of the victim, Salim, said, "I was actually surprised. I was able to look up and look into his eyes. He looked right at me. He looked pretty upset. I was shocked by the emotion in his face." The judge said that his actions were pure evil and he was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole in 25 years. There is no death penalty in Canada. Justice had been served. However, investigators were going to be investigated themselves. Justice Gloria Epstein was going to look into the public concerns about the police not investigating these missing gay men that they were informed of years prior. The public strongly believed that because they were brown gay men, the police had no action. The police chief, Mark Saunders, was found to have shut down Project Houston for absolutely no reason, and that he had blamed the LGBTQ+ community for the police's inability to find evidence. Now, Sergeant Paul Gauthier was the one who let Bruce go when he came in after trying to strangle the survivor inside the van, and Paul believed Bruce when he said he was the one who was assaulted instead. So Paul was actually the one charged with professional misconduct after a detective in Nzinga said that Paul had blatant disregard for policy and procedures. However, Paul has said that he believes he's only the fall guy for the investigators who needed a scapegoat. He said the night he let Bruce go, this was approved of by the supervisor, the staff sergeant, and the detective sergeant. And he also says that the chief, Mark Saunders, and the detective in Nzinga had a close relationship, and that is why they got together to blame him. He pled not guilty, and it turned out the police had been lacking in investigating not only the missing gay men, but missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls as well. Altogether, this review found that some investigators had misconceptions or stereotypical ideas about the LGBTQ+ community that impeded their work. Judge Epstein said that the systemic failure is perhaps the most troubling, that proper missing persons investigations should not depend on whose voices are the loudest or most empowered in sounding the alarm. So do you think that it was mainly this detective Paul Gauthier who was the only one who botched this entire investigation or the investigations of the gay men? Or do you think that this is a department-wide problem? I personally think it is prejudice against gay and brown individuals that causes a lot of their murders or disappearances to be unsolved. Do you believe there are more victims? And when do you think Bruce actually began killing? Was it only the 8 victims, or was it much, much earlier? Because he was 60 when he was caught, and when the disappearances started in 1970, he would have been 20 years old. That is around the time that a serial killer can start killing. Could he have been killing 40 years prior to when they think he did? I truly hope that they're looking into possibly more victims and more connections and they don't just give up, because I think that it's something that could have been happening much earlier and maybe in different locations. Maybe it wasn't in the gay village. Maybe it was where he traveled or where he did other landscaping jobs. But I think it needs to be looked into further. And this case is just mind-blowing with all of the different victims, and I'm just glad that I could find a lot of information on them, because I feel like a lot of the times when there's lots of different victims, it's just kind of looked over you know, the victims, here's their name, but that's it. That's all you get. But this case, I really did find a lot about them, and that makes my heart so happy. So I'm happy that I could share these all with you, share all of their lives prior to being a victim. And I truly hope that you learned about these wonderful men and what was taken from them. But don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.